talk is called SolarWinds Post-Exploitation for Red Teams and Fun. My name is James Donlon. I am a red team operator at Arminen. Arminen is a new company. We were founded by Kevin Mandia. And really, we are developing the ultimate attacker that uses AI agents to execute complex attack chains across multiple modalities at machine speed. So this presentation, this will be just kind of a short presentation about some things that we have found during several red team assessments when we had access to SolarWinds via a compromised user. So no new vulnerabilities or disclosures here, but just some interesting methodology and things that we thought would other red teams might benefit from, just to kind of to show off some methodology and stuff there. So moving into the agenda, like I said, this will be a very short presentation. We will just give kind of some existing research that we have found that we saw in the past 5 or so years. And then from there, we'll move into what we have found. So essentially some passback attacks from SolarWinds that can result in hashed credential disclosure, as well as plain text credential disclosure, as well as some relay attacks, including a passback to LDAP, as well as MSSQL. So just a quick overview for anyone who's unfamiliar. What is SolarWinds? So previously, it was called SolarWinds Orion. Now they have a full platform. I believe it's called Observability. Basically, there's different ways you can use it, but the one that I was testing is a self-hosted platform. Essentially, what it's used for is for network application and configuration monitoring and alerting. So, for example, if you have a bunch of machines with SolarWinds running on it, you can kind of monitor if one of them goes down, if CPU usage spikes, etc. There's a lot more to it, but that's basically it. So existing research. There is quite a bit of research into SolarWinds from a red team perspective. So just kind of quick overview, just some things that we found that has been really useful for red teams, starting with this one over here. Back in like 2020 or 2021, I had found this blog post and had basically found a way to use SolarWinds or abuse SolarWinds to deploy C2 beacons. So this blog post here is very interesting, very useful. We'll kind of recap this research here in a second. In addition, Rob Fuller did some really good research way back 2020, and I think even before, basically looking at how to dump passwords from SolarWinds Orion. So, once you compromise SolarWinds, if you have access to the database itself, how encryption works and everything there. And he actually had a tool that was very useful for a while called SolarFlare. Since then, their encryption has changed a little bit. And kind of talking about that, Atreides Partners, they had a decent blog post looking specifically at the cryptography used within SolarWinds. So as far as the actual database and encryption, we're not going to really talk about that here. It's going to be a little bit higher level and a little bit different, just kind of getting to that access before we start, dumping passwords, etc. So talking about some previous research, I mentioned you could use SolarWinds Orion to deploy C2 beacons, for example. So just going to go through that flow, kind of show what that looks like. So as I mentioned, within SolarWinds, you have the ability to configure alerts. So there's all kinds of different things you can alert on, within a network or host-based. So you have Alert Manager, and within there, you can create a trigger action. So when an alert happens or is sent, you can have a trigger action to do something. And the cool thing is for a red team, there's a lot of different actions you can configure within a trigger action. One of those, which is very interesting, is you can execute an external program or a VB script. So this one in particular is very useful because you can configure a trigger that will execute an arbitrary executable, for example, that you can configure to happen whenever you want. So the classic example back in like 2021, I did actually use this on a large financial client. So what we did is we set up Cobalt Strike. This is, this is not this is not how you do it in a real environment, but just purely for example, pointing to beacon x64.exe. You can configure to point to that, and then basically just show the UNC path. So it'll reach out to an arbitrary machine. In this case, this is an attacker machine. And then you can also configure authentication, which in this case is not really needed. So whenever you add the action and you go ahead, you can actually simulate the action. So you don't need to actually wait for it to happen. You can immediately use this now. So you can select, for example, a domain controller, hit execute, and it will reach out, hold down your beacon, and execute it. So this was very useful on a red team that I was on way back in 2021. We had some very limited access, and we ended up finding a user that had access to SolarWinds. And within SolarWinds, they had the ability to add alerts and manage them. And then from there, we kind of went with this flow, and it ended up with full domain compromise. So the good thing is that SolarWinds has changed this since then, so that if you try to create this type of alert for both executables or programs, as well as the VB script, it requires approval by an administrator. So you can no longer just take a compromised user and immediately compromise the domain. You do need to have this approved. And the interesting thing here is from this this change here is actually when a coworker and I found two different vulnerabilities that were related to this specific functionality. We can't really talk about that here just because they're not they haven't been fixed yet, but we should have a blog post coming out pretty soon talking about this once SolarWinds actually fixes that and has a CVE. So yeah, that this is the disclosure here. So just starting February 10th and as recent as yesterday, they should have a CVE soon for one of those issues. We'll, like I said, have a blog post for those soon. So next section, moving on from the previous research, some of the stuff that I found more recently that I don't believe has been disclosed. So like I said, these are not going to be new vulnerabilities. These are purely just going to be some methodology to kind of take advantage of how SolarWinds works. So starting with stored credential passbacks. So passback attack, if anyone has ever seen or is familiar with, the classic example I believe would probably be from a printer. So if you have a printer in an environment that is configured with LDAP, there's a lot of cases where you can cause a passback where you can change the IP address and try to trigger an authentication flow to LDAP, but instead of the LDAP server, you're actually sending it to yourself, so you can capture credentials that way. So running through this flow, within SolarWinds, you have the ability to deploy an agent on the network. So deploying the SolarWinds agent to a system so that SolarWinds can monitor that system. So just running through this, you can add an IP address or host name. And then you can assign credentials. So this is purely functionality within SolarWinds. This is not a vulnerability, but since you can choose an arbitrary IP address, what you can do is just point it to your attacker box. And the nice thing for Red Team is that if there's credentials stored within SolarWinds, you can go ahead and select whatever you want and then assign that credential and go ahead and validate it. So in this case, this is purely a lab example, but we have a domain administrator saved here in SolarWinds. The nice thing is you can go ahead and test that credential. So in the previous step, we selected our attack IP. We selected our domain admin. We're going to test that. And what happens is, if you have a listener, like Responder, for example, it sends a NTLM-v2 authentication attempt with that stored credential. So that by itself is useful. You could take this offline, try to recover it with something like Hashcat. If there's a system that does not require SMB signing, you could potentially relay that over SMB. That is, still a thing, but less of a thing in more mature environments. So taking that further, if you find the MSSQL instance for SolarWinds, you can go ahead and set up a relay to that database if it is exposed externally, which is the recommended configuration. So instead of sending this to yourself and just capturing it, you can relay to the MSSQL database. So same thing, test, and this is my NTLM relay targeting the MSSQL instance. And from here, you can see we're able to authenticate against the MSSQL database and start an interactive shell. So from here, this is where, the typical credential dumping, decryption, or maybe even adding a new user or adding permissions to a compromised user. So that way you can have, full admin over SolarWinds. There's a lot of additional post-exploitation that can be done here. We're not going to delve into that here. We're just purely showing this relay attack. So just going to show that full flow here. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to set up our listener and our relay to the MSSQL database. Now we are choosing the credential. We're just going to hit test. You can see very quickly it already worked. So captured that authentication attempt, relayed it against MSSQL, and then now we have a shell interactive session within the SQL database. So now just kind of showing, utilizing that session. We're going to enum the DB. So this is just the typical SolarWinds database configuration. You have Orion, the logs, flow storage. We're going to use SolarWinds Orion, so connecting to that specific database. And from here, this is how we're going to pull down account IDs, password hashes, salts, etc., whether the account is enabled, if they're an admin, etc. So here's the admin. This is when I was testing adding a backdoor account, etc. There's a lot you can do here. Here's the domain admin. Oops, it already clicked off. The domain admin is right down here. That's stored password for that. So that's the full flow there. That is very useful. For red teams, if you are able to get into this functionality within SolarWinds, that is a very useful flow for potentially relaying to the database and doing all kinds of stuff there. So moving on. So the next thing we're going to talk about, and this is even more useful in my experience, is HTTP authentication to LDAP relay. So in the previous step, we saw SMB authentication. And in this step, we're going to see HTTP authentication, which can be relayed to LDAP. So within SolarWinds, you have another trigger action where you can send a GET or POST request to a web server. And unlike the previous attack where we were able to execute an executable or a program, this one does not require admin administrative approval. So this one is very simple. You just configure a URL. So in this case, my attacker box, and then you can choose the authentication type that you want. So in this case, we have NTLM, and just like the other one, we can choose a stored credential. In this case, we're just going to choose the domain admin. If we set up a relay against an LDAP server, we can go ahead and simulate the action. We don't actually need to save it and wait for it to happen. Click execute. You can see our relay. We have caught HTTP authentication, and we have relayed that against the LDAP server. From here, there's a lot of things you could do. You could have an interactive session. You could do some sort of Kerberos delegation. There's a lot of different things here. In this case, we're a domain admin, so we are privileged. So yeah, there's a lot of different things there. So just showing this flow. So Within Alert Manager, we're going to go ahead and create the alert. We're going to configure it. So you can see here, just as I showed before, we're just targeting our attacker box. We're going to select NTLM authentication. We're going to choose our domain admin that is stored within SolarWinds, setting up our relay over here. And then we're going to go ahead and test the action. So this here doesn't matter. You can select whatever you want. Once you hit execute, you can see it works. In my lab, I was too lazy to set up LDAP-S, so part of it fails to actually do anything against LDAP. But in a real world scenario, they would probably have LDAP-S. But yeah, you can see the relay has worked. It's trying to create a user, adding to enterprise admins, etc. That is probably not something you want to do in a real world scenario. You probably want to be a little bit more surgical. But yeah, our relay has succeeded. And then a little extra here. Let's see. So we're going to go back to edit the action. We're going to set up a responder listener instead of a relay. And in here, if you notice before, within authentication, if you choose basic authentication and select our domain admin, instead of a relay, we are going to collect the plain text password for the user. So what it does is it pulls it down and just sends a basic authentication request with the clear text or plain text domain admin password. So that's a good way to, if you don't want a relay, you could just selectively pull out any credentials you want that are stored within SolarWinds. Okay, so this is just showing the flow there. And then this is the plain text password. So when I saw this, I was kind of surprised. I didn't really expect that to happen, but here we are. Conclusion. So yeah, short and sweet. Conclusion is that there's a lot more. There's several other products that SolarWinds has. There's more trigger actions. There's a lot more attack surface that I have not, finished exploring and doing research on. There is active exploitation of SolarWinds Help Desk, for example, as of like a month ago. That is a completely different product. And, for example, Web Help Desk, there was some research that discovered additional deserialization issues, a lot of attack surface there, a lot of stuff that you can look at. So really the main conclusion here is if you are a red team operator or even just an internal pen tester, look at applications and services. This is something that I've seen on so many networks and just kind of glossed over it because, generally we're getting DA via other compromise paths that are specific to Active Directory. However, there are always going to be a lot of other services, applications on networks that have a lot of attack surface. And if you get access to one of those services like SolarWinds, there is quite a bit of impact that you can have on an internal network. So just kind of talking about research. If you find something interesting like SolarWinds, look to see if there's a trial that you can download. SolarWinds makes it really easy to download trials for observability, for web help desk. Lab it up. So that's what I did. So Ludus, if anyone's unfamiliar, check out Ludus. It is awesome for standing up quick and easy lab scenarios. You can have a full Active Directory environment with all kinds of different misconfigurations for testing out vulnerabilities or attack paths. Lab it up. Download trials is on there twice. Do research. So once you have it labbed up, just do research, look at different potential attack paths, write up methodology. You can have quite a bit of internal methodology for specific services that is completely outside of the normal, Active Directory attack chains. So that's pretty much it. Like I said, there are probably some additional research that we'll be doing. We should have a blog post here soon for those 2 vulnerabilities that we found in SolarWinds. And the last thing I want to say is that like I mentioned before, none of this is, you know, a vulnerability in and of itself. SolarWinds does a pretty good job of having permissions properly enforced. So all of the previous stuff, which I probably should have mentioned before, you do need a good amount of access to SolarWinds to actually perform, you know, those attacks. So the ability to create an alert, you need the ability to manage alerts. You know, a low-level user cannot do that. So this is purely for a red team performing post-exploitation. So, you know, if you're on a red team and you do compromise a user with access to SolarWinds, definitely look at it. There's a lot you can do there. So that's it for me. Thank you.